Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. This is the third event in our new special series called the National Book Festival Presents. I'm Sherry Werb, and I'm director of the Center for Learning, Literacy, and Engagement here at the Library of Congress. Among many things, the center is responsible for organizing our National Book Festival, which we held for the 19th time last month on August 31st. As we've come to expect with the festival, we saw massive crowds there, and I hope you were among the happy audiences and that you had a chance to see and hear from your favorite authors. Just wanted to get a sense of the audience. How many of you went to the book festival this year? Excellent, thank you. Please mark your calendar for next year's festival, which will be held on August 22nd, 2020 at the Washington Convention Center. And I hope I'll see you there. We initiated this National Book Festival Presents series because so many of our attendees, people who can't live without books like Thomas Jefferson, and like many of you, told us that they love the festival so much that they wished it would last for more than one day. So we've answered your requests by putting together a series that will feature authors throughout the year, one at a time, and with a full spotlight, and with connections to the library's collections. I have one more question to ask. How many of you have been to the library before this evening? Terrific. And how many are here for the first time? Wonderful. Please come back. We have 5 more programs like this scheduled through November. These audiences are Captain Underpants and Dogman creator Dave Pilkey, mystery writer Alexander McCall Smith, and renowned religion writer Karen Armstrong, Brad Meltzer, who writes for adults as well as young people, and Andre Asiman, author of Call Me By Your Name and its sequel, Find Me. You can visit our website at loc.gov for more information and for tickets. But tonight, I'm excited to introduce our author. She is the world-renowned writer of novels, novels and short stories such as The Art of Death, Claire of the Sea Light, and Brother, I'm Dying. Her acclaim includes a National Book Critics Circle Award and a coveted selection by the Oprah's Book Club. Both Essence and 17 magazines have awarded her fiction prizes, and when she was only in her 20s, Harper's Bazaar named her one of 20 people who will make a difference. That prediction surely came true. She has also received a MacArthur Fellowship, Genius Award, and a Ford Fellowship, and Jane Magazine called her one of 15 gutsiest women of the year. Born in Haiti, Edwidge Danticat came to America when she was 12. She published her first work in English when she was only 14. Her work eloquently speaks of national identity, bicultural lives, mother-daughter bonds, and the relationships of expatriate ethnic communities to their homelands. In her first novel, Breath, Eyes, Memory, Edwidge Danticat writes of a woman conceived in violence and about her tumultuous relationship with her mother. In her family memoir, Brother, I'm Dying, she writes of the pain of being separated from her parents at age 4, only to be reunited with them in America when she was 12, and then of being an immigrant in a strange land. Danticat also writes for young people, including Untwine, which was named a Bank Street College of Education Best Children's Book of the Year, and the picture book, My Mommy Medicine. She will be joined this evening by Marie Arana, herself an acclaimed writer and the literary director of the National Book Festival. Marie is also the former editor of the Washington Post Book World. Please welcome Edwidge Danticat and Marie Arana.
Hello and welcome to you all. It's such a pleasure to be here for many, many reasons, but Edwidge and I, have become friends after we were actually colleagues at one time. We worked on a film together, Girl Rising, and you wrote the part about the Caribbean, and I wrote the part about Latin America, South America. So we had that early meeting, Edwidge, before we even knew each other.
Yes.
Collaborating. Yes. So it's wonderful to be actually collaborating with you in person here. And it's such a pleasure for me to have read this newest book of yours, which we'll talk about in a minute. But I want to talk about the fact that, being children of diaspora, both of us, and having arrived when we were girls at about the same age. And yet, there's so much that we have in common, and yet that there's so much that has informed us about your experience in Haiti with all of the books that you've written. Tell us about that early life, those first 12 years in Haiti. And you were at first without your father and then without your mother and then to the country that they had immigrated to.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I wanted to thank you all for coming and thank you, Marie, for doing this. Marie has a book out now soon that you should get also.
Thank you.
Plug. So those first 12 years, and it's interesting, and I'm sure as it is for you, to look back now. Like, I turned 50 this year, so to look back at your early life as it's sort of drifting into the distance. But basically, my first 12 years, I was born in Haiti in 1969. During the Duvalier dictatorship, my dad left Haiti when I was 2. And left for many reasons, some mostly economic, but also naturally, the tensions of the place that we couldn't live there without feeling. And then when my mom, 2 years after that, my mom left, and my brother, one brother and I stayed with my aunt and uncle. And my aunt and uncle, my uncle was a minister, and his wife, so we were many in the house in that same situation whose parents were in the Dominican Republic or in Canada, so it was kind of like young children with 2 older people, but with other relatives streaming in and out. So it was that kind of childhood. I felt we all knew that we had parents in other countries who would eventually send for us. So that was always part of the reality of our lives. But we met, we went to school, and we had a kind of life that was made possible by the fact that all of us, our parents, were abroad because they would send money. And so in the summer, we went to the countryside, and where it was freer than the city because you can be, out in nature more. And then when I was 8, my parents came back to visit, and that's when my parents were undocumented when they were, for a while here, and then they came back, and we had 2 U.S.-born brothers. I think one of my brothers is here, and then they came back with them, and then they were able to file the papers for us when I was 12. I moved to Brooklyn. My brother and I moved to Brooklyn, and then we were all a family again when I was 12 years old.
Well, how was that? How was that for you, Edwidge? Because by 12, you are a formed person. I always remember what Garcia Marquez said, which is, you are the writer you're going to be by the time you're 8. Mm-hmm. And so you came as a formed person. In fact, you had already begun, I think, doing a little writing when you were 9 or so. And yet you were coming to a country that your parents already knew. I mean, they knew what they were bringing you to. How was that for you? And did you have to leave that little girl behind in many ways?
Well, it's funny, this past weekend I was with a writer who was from Australia and wrote, Maria, I'm forgetting her last name, but she wrote a book called Asthmatic, and it was about trauma. And then in one of the chapter, she said, like, show me a girl at 7 and I'll show you the woman she's going to become. And I can't remember 7, but certainly I think at 12, all of those sensibilities were formed. And when I think of younger people in my family who came a little bit younger, things that you remember versus things you don't remember. But I was always, in my family, even though I was very quiet, people would say, les judas, it's like a nosy. I was really nosy. I was like soaking things in. And I wasn't doing it necessarily for stories, but I was observing, and I was very much interested in books and writing and thinking how that was transformed. So having suddenly a whole new, of landing in a place with, and also having formed, like, when you're in this kind of household with a lot of surrogate parenting, because you have the uncles, you have the aunts who are taking this place of your, so your mother, your father, and so you have different roles. And then in New York, it was very different, and not knowing the language certainly, and then suddenly when you do, you know it better than your parents suddenly. And one of the things that I remember being very surprised by how much children, like that situation where children are interpreting for their parents. And so you can be in a house where it's a situation where you're not even allowed to look at your parents in the eye, but they'll take you to the doctor, and then you're interpreting like the most sensitive information for your parents. And the same way that even when I was in Haiti as a little girl, people would ask me to write letters, sometimes very love letters for people. And so it kind of gave you like an entry into people's lives that I think fed into my being a writer. It's like, what is better for a nosy person than to be allowed into, the most intimate spaces of people's lives. Right. And then afterwards, people pretend like it didn't happen. Like, okay, that was just a moment, and then now you go back to being a small child,
And of course, you're interpreting more than just language when you're put in that position.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was interested in the New York Times headline that went along with the review for your book, and it said, Haitians may leave their country, but it never leaves them. And I think that was actually quoting you to some degree. Tell us about that. What is it about? I think there are immigrants who leave their countries behind, and then they're not really replicated in their households or in their hearts or in their minds. How is that for you as a Haitian and as not leaving your country behind?
Yeah. Well, that was, they were courting my parents, who always said that to us, said we may have left Haiti, but it didn't leave us. And it was certainly in the house, in the language and the food we ate, and the church we attended, and the neighborhoods, like the people who were around us. But also, I think in the responsibility we felt, and in the connection we felt to the people back home, to the family members who we left back home, and I think also the pain of certain moments, like even this moment now that we're living in Haiti, where and there's a lot of direct communication, with family members. So, you have your cousins who send WhatsApp. They're like, we couldn't leave the house today. There was the strike again on the street. There was, even in this this morning, today. So it's very, there's part of it is also, the pride, the history, the things that our parents were saying to us to lift us up, but part of blended into that was this connection that was also tied to pain, because that there were often things happening back home that were painful to us, that we just, you felt you couldn't, that still was part of us. That is part of us at this very moment, that I'm sitting here speaking to you.
Well, that's what you carry with you in the immigrant experience. You were not read to as a child. You said you basically learned storytelling from the oral tradition, because people told stories in family, at the dinner table, etc. How has that colored, that oral tradition? how has that colored your own writing and your own view of writing?
Well, I always, say to people, I think my first writing teachers were the storytellers of my childhood, and they were often people who, in their daily lives, weren't really celebrated much, and who are really hardworking, and they were people who, at least in the case of my family, they were poor people. They weren't, so they would go into the public space and kind of have to bow their heads and have to be careful. But when they were in that space, when they were telling a story, when they were laughing, they were free. And it was also, this moment of oral storytelling, whether it was in the provinces or whether it was in the city, was one of the few times that I would sometimes see the adults in my life, really happily interacting with us, because the rest of the time it was all really, especially with young girls, it was like, close your legs, scrub your face, it was always like directions. But in those moments, it was just really, people were happy and it was lively, and they were singing, there were songs in the stories, there was suspense, and there was really this connection with the young people. And so I would look at that and really be in awe. It was like, what was this thing that was transforming the mood of these really usually stern women in my life?
Right.
But I would look at that and think, I don't think I can do that, because I was shy. I didn't have that sort of performance part to me. But then when I started reading books, I thought, oh, this is another way that this is done, where you really don't have to be performing. But then you realize, too, that you lose something in the living story. Because I remember when there was a collection of folktales called The Magic Orange Tree and Other Folktales by a wonderful storyteller, Diane Wilkstein, and I remember reading those and then trying to tell them to my mother. I was like, this is how she wrote it. And my mother's like, no, that's not how it is. And then she would tell me her version. And I would tell my aunt, she was like, no, and then her version was different than my mother's. So then you realize there's something valuable to the living story. Right. But when that person is gone, that version of the story is gone. But when you write something, and I think that's what I felt was more fitted to my personality, that sort of intimate, quiet way of telling a story in language and on paper, where you revise it, and it may not be as lively as a story that's being told, but at least it exists in this way.
But that's really interesting what you say, because a story is dynamic, organic. If you're in a group and you're watching the people's faces to whom you're telling the story, and there's a sense that you're getting back as you're telling the story. Mm-hmm. When you're actually writing, you are all alone. You are speaking into the void, and you are writing without a reaction. But you're probably remembering something about, especially when you're a little girl listening to those stories, about rhythm and tension and resolution and all that sort of thing. For whom do you write when you sit down and write?
Well, it's interesting. One way that I would, before I tell you for whom I write, and it won't surprise you, but one way that I've comforted myself with this idea of the living story versus the story that you write is that there was, and I put it on Breath I's memory, there's this proverb that my grandmother used to say, but she would say it as a cautionary, we were living in the dictatorship. You had to be, words had a lot of power. You had to be really careful what you said. And she would say, parole gen pied, parole gen zèle. Words have wings, words have feet. And it was told to you, to be like, oh, that means you have to be careful what you said. But for me, when I heard that, I was like, oh, it's a way that the words will find their way, especially, and it's proven true for me, within my writing, being here tonight, for example, in a way that you couldn't guide the words. But when I started writing, and I think to a certain extent, up until this very moment, I really started writing for the girl I was when I arrived here at 12 years old. And I had just gone through the whole public library. They had a shelf. It was like Livre Haïtien with the Haitian books, Haitian novels that I had not had a chance to read in school in Haiti. And I just went through those books, like Jacques Romain, Jacques-Stéphane Alexis, Marie-Vieux Chauvet, Gigi Dominique, and all the Haitian writers that they had on that shelf, and I read through. And then I read Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings with a dictionary. And then I remember thinking, like, I wanted something else, like that was a combination of all those things so far, and something that was purely me. So I started writing, like Toni Morrison said, if there's a book that you want to read and it doesn't exist, you write it. And so I really was writing for that girl. And to a certain extent, I feel like I still am. Like I'm still writing for that. I'm writing for that girl who went to that library and was looking for that thing. And we all, if you're a voracious reader, you know that feeling. You're like, I'm looking for something. And then you find something close, but you're like, eh. So I feel like what I write is for that girl who was looking for those books. You know,
that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and of course, you mentioned library. We're sitting in the largest
Like the
cultural
library.
institution in the world, a wonderful library. Libraries have meant something to you?
Oh, absolutely. And I'd love to hear about like you and libraries too, because I think I read something that you'd written about that. But so when I got to New York, my dad, I remember, took me to the main branch of the Brooklyn Public Library. And at that time, you can only borrow 10 books. And I borrowed 10 books, and then like 3 days later, I would bring my 10 books back. And I just remember the first time he took me, and I was like, you mean they're gonna let me keep the books for a while? Like I'm gonna go home with these books? And he said, yeah. And I was amazed that they were trusting me with these books. Of course, he had to show like his gas bill or something to prove where we lived, and they could have come for the books if they wanted. But it just was like, wow, I get to live with these books for a little while. It just felt amazing to just be. And then you would walk into it was like, the Brooklyn Public Library is like a temple, a place like this, and you just walk in, you're like, oh my goodness, all these books, and you can touch them. So that library just felt like church to me. It just felt like a religious experience to me. Just like all the books, because I'd owned books in my, I had owned like a book now and then, but I didn't. It felt like to be allowed to be trusted with these books was an amazing experience. How about for you?
Well, I'm having the same feeling because I'm remembering that feeling of first taking a book out of a library, which I didn't encounter until I was 10 years old and in this country, newly in this country. And it was almost like being a thief. I mean, you felt like a thief. And it was the same. I had that same feeling many years later when I was taking home a baby from the hospital. It was like, they let people do this?
I know. It's like, I can take her. Yes, that's true. So true, yeah. I remember with the baby too, I was looking. I was like, where is the manual?
This must be against the law. It must be against the law. You mentioned something very important about being in Haiti and the things that you could say and the things that you couldn't say because history was somewhere out there in the streets and perhaps even overtaking you. The tie to history, particularly in your books, is very strong. History is a character in so many of your books. How did that come to be? How is it that you began to think not only of just narratives about human beings and what happens to them, but about the way that, as Faulkner said, the past is never past. It's, the past is never, what is it? What is it again? The past is never gone. It's not even past or whatever.
Yeah,
and you have that feeling.
Closer to it.
Right.
There must be a Faulkner scholar in the audience. I think it goes back to the oral storytelling, and there was a kind of double entendre in even certain things that you were told, and there's, I think, and I write about this in Create Dangerously, the example of one of our great poets, Félix Maurice Leroy, who lived in Haiti during the dictatorship and rewrote in Creole Antigone and staged it. And it was a response to when people were killed and they couldn't get their dead out of the street because I would indict you. And he wanted to stay in Haiti, wanted to write, but called the Greeks and sort of repatriated the Greeks. And so history also just our relationship with history, is so rich, and that will say, if you are speaking to some Haitians within like 10 minutes, you'll learn that we were the first Black republic in the Western Hemisphere.
Right.
And you should know that,
Yeah.
But, there are things like historically that we're very proud of, and then there are things that are more painful, that are also painful. The fact that independence made us pariahs in the world, embargoed economically, sort of straddled the country, and so all of these things, we like this relationship with history, both triumphant and painful, and all the repercussions in the present. And so, for example, the way I first learned about, I wrote a book called The Farming of Bones about a massacre of Haitian cane workers in the Dominican Republic. And the first time I heard about it was through an oral, telling, where someone was saying, they were talking about someone who had gone over to the Dominican Republic, and they said, I hope she comes back okay. I hope it's not like the time of the coup de couteau, which is not the historical term, but it's like people like coup de couteau literally means like the knifing. And then what is the knifing? In Spanish, el corte, and then you're like, you just start, and then it starts like that, and I started looking into it. So there was that always, you were like living history all the time, but I was always interested in the lacunae of history, like those gaps that people don't talk about. And so for me, I feel like even a thread would lead me to researching and finding out about it. And then fiction is great for that, because you can invent a person and put them in that gap, right? And then you can have them tell that story, and you can have them follow a thread throughout their history. So that even when I wrote about my father and my uncle, I felt like I couldn't write about them without writing about even the history of the country, the way that it affected their daily lives. So, but I'm also fascinated by history, but how it's reflected in the moments that we are living.
Well, it certainly comes alive in your work. I'm thinking of The Farming of Bones, for instance, which was at the time that of Trujillo, of Rafael Trujillo, who decided that he was going to do an ethnic cleansing of the Dominican Republic, and he began to kill everybody who was of Haitian descent. And it was called the Parsley Massacre. Yeah. Why?
And Rita Dove wrote a very wonderful
yes,
poem
Rita
about
Dove did.
it.
And
because people were one way, because there were places in the on the border, and that's one of the places I began my research, where you couldn't even tell people apart. And so one way that they could tell if you were Haitian or Dominican were by ask people to say the word perejil. And as you can tell, I would have failed, because you had the trilling of the R, was difficult. It was harder for a person of Haitian descent to say, and then that's how they would differentiate. And then there was something that went as far as like in the Bible, there's like the shibboleth where people were asked to say that. So it's sort of like weird, interesting ways that history repeats itself, because when you can't build a wall, when you can't like close this river, then you go to language, right? And when you can't differentiate physically or phenotypically, then you go to words. And for me, that was, and that's Rita in the Rita Dove poem Parsley. She discusses it too. And for me, it's like the idea of using language as a border was dictators are often very maniacal geniuses sometimes, not stable geniuses, but so it was just like
are ingenious maniacs.
Yes,
Right.
exactly. So then exactly, that's probably more accurate. And then so for somebody to have like sat around and think of that, it's like Calin Forché with the ears. So I wanted to, for me, that's the kind of history too that you feel like you couldn't make this up. And people often, when they read that book, they're like, "Did you make that thing up about the parsley?" I was like, "No, some maniac did."
Right, yeah. Right. Well, in that instance, he was a dictator who was blaming all the ills of his country to this group of people that had, you know, actually Haiti had been in. This is an island that is divided between the Dominican Republic and Haiti, and they're all present on an island. But yet he singled these out, the Haitians out. This has often happened in history, that Haitians get blamed. I'm thinking also of your extraordinary independence, wars of independence, which actually not only inspired the wars of independence in Latin America, Alexandre Pétion, who was the president at the time, actually funded the liberation of Latin America from Spain. And the United States was blaming Haiti in a way for revolutionizing the whole business of slavery, which at that point was so was a money-making operation in the United States. And then people blamed Haiti again in the whole AIDS crisis, I remember, and you have written about this. So there seems to be this thing of blame against Haitians. How do you feel about that?
Well, I don't like it one bit.
I know.
as you can imagine. But I think it has some real consequences, right? And starting from the creation of the nation, right? From and Haiti and the United States were the first two republics in this hemisphere, and Haiti was the first place that enslaved people overcame their masters and created their nation. It was to a lot of people who still were enslaving people, it was a bad example, you know. And you had the founding fathers like pulling their wigs out to like, what are we going to do with this, you know, with this example nearby. And one of the ways was to embargo Haiti, like to completely isolate Haiti. And I think it's just, you know, from that point on, from like the creation, from the beginning of that's sort of the piling on of the blame. But it has actual consequences, like, for example, you know, with the remarks that the president made about Haiti, for example. So that's humiliating, that's degrading, that's awful, but that also reflects immigration policy.
Absolutely.
Of trying to, you know, they're in court now trying to completely revoke temporary protected status, canceling visas. So it's not just, I think, the way that Haiti is maligned. It's not just words, often it has actual consequences and policy and an immigration policy that for years, like if someone from Cuba came on the same boat as someone from Haiti, the person from Haiti was detained and returned, the person from Cuba was kept. So it has actually real policy implications that affect people's lives, you know, sometimes in terrible ways, including my own uncle, who I wrote my memoir about, Brother, I'm Dying, who came in 2004 when there was some trouble in Haiti. He was 81 years old and had survived throat cancer and spoke with a voice box. So he had a valid visa, had been coming to the U.S. for 30 years. But that day, because they asked how long he would be staying, he said he would be staying longer. He said, well, he requested asylum, was detained, had his medication taken away, and 5 days later died chained to a hospital bed in immigration custody. So those things, like that might not have happened to him if he were from a different place. So there's the rhetoric of that sort of maligning, but there are also real life consequences for those.
You've talked about that in your books, and it's quite striking, the difference between the way Haitians are received in this country and the way perhaps Cubans were received, which is a completely different way. But the history that most comes alive in this particular book, and I want to talk about everything inside. It's a wonderful book. And it has all of the aspects of Edwidge's writing that you would expect, a kind of lyrical precision, a very intense sort of internal lives of people, and yet told in this economical way that you have, Edwidge, of getting across things in a pristine, unadorned, and I would say, sentimental way. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. The history that I most feel in this book is, of course, a very recent history. It's the earthquake of 2010. And what was the impact of that earthquake? How many people died? It was hundreds of thousands.
Yeah. Well, it's soon it'll be the 10th anniversary of the earthquake, and it's very hard to imagine that it's almost been 10 years. The estimated number was something like 300,000, and with 1.5 million people initially displaced, and so I lost some family members and friends. Certainly, I think many of us, so many of us did. And one of the things that initially, in the initial moments, in terms of, in the part that goes to, of course, there's all kinds of ways that one could talk about the earthquake economically, building codes, but for me, one of the initial things was the lack of rituals for a lot of people, and even in the case of my own cousin, right, who our family home had collapsed, and he and my cousin and his son died there, and then just like of the whole thing of reclaiming bodies, burying people, and so that's one of the things that with this distance I wanted to, and one of the stories talk about, so like what is the aftermath of grief when you've had no rituals, right? And for a lot of people, and there were a lot of people like that who I knew, who they were saying, she left that morning and then we've never seen her since. And often there might be someone who was walking down the street and then they're taking to the mass grave, and a family member, you don't have a place to go, you don't have a plot of land, you don't have at least in our case with my cousin, we knew exactly, we had to excavate, but that you knew the exact location. But there were a lot of people who said goodbye to someone that morning that they never saw again. And so, and what does that mean in terms of, if you're thinking in terms of story, in terms of mourning, in terms of elegy and eulogy, and especially in a place where often the way we bury people is the last great honor we pay them. And then, so that's one thing I wanted to explore in this way. And again, as I was saying, there's like all these other ways, and those ways will come up, as the anniversary comes, with how do we honor the dead, really. And so for me, it's story, it's remembering, it's naming, it's also wrestling with the inability to actually put a period at the end of that, that kind of sentence.
I want to just mention in the middle of all of this that there is a wonderful display as you came in and as you will go out that the library has put together of your books, of pictures of Haiti, of very wonderful sort of artifacts about Haiti. A lot of it represents the breadth, I think, of your writing, Edwidge, because you range, and we were talking about this a little bit in the back, you range from essays and nonfiction, memoir, to historical novels, to short stories. You have you're all over the place, Anna. You don't concentrate on one thing.
In a good way, right?
In a good way, all over the place.
Because you do the same.
But here's the question I want to ask you, is do you write poetry?
None that I would ever share with anybody alive.
What is your feeling about poetry? Because you can read Edwidge Danticat on the sentence level. And it is, you almost feel you could push this woman into poetry.
Well, I love poetry. I actually did start out writing poetry, and I think it was very good training, and for the economy of it, for that. And I read a lot of poetry when I'm writing. So, but I just feel like it would be, I need more room, you know. And my books are short, relatively, you know, like for fiction books they're short, but I still feel like I need more room than the poetry. But I love working on that level too, on the sentence level. And I feel like the best poets, you know, just like give you, just like they can give you an image and like a whole story in one sentence. And I love reading the type of poets where you sit there, it's like, oh,
Yeah.
you just blew me
Knock
away.
you out of the park. Yeah, absolutely. That you've taught. I mean, you've taught before, and I know there will probably be some students in this hall. What do you say to aspiring writers? How do you tend to tell them not to try it, and then they will try it because they really want to, or do you actually have, sort of a words of encouragement?
Oh, I will just say initially, well, first, for me, my first writing, like the first day of seminar, I'll say we're all writers here. I'm a writer, you're a writer. And facing the blank page, we all start in the same place. So I think I always like to sort of stabilize that space, like we're in this together. And then to just write, you know, I don't tell people what to write. I feel like what I am in the classroom, especially among writers, is a kind of midwife, you know. Like, this thing is going to happen. It's like, as my midwife said, it's going to happen whether you want it to or not. You just now have to cooperate a little bit to make it less painful.
Right.
And so I see myself as like that, or maybe a doula, right? And so, and I try to grasp like what the person is trying to do and help them in that direction. But I don't like to impose, because when I would go to classes and people would say, oh, I don't even understand what you're doing. And it takes a lot of, you know, I guess, passion or stubbornness to overlook negative things that people, and you can kill a baby writer like that if you're not careful. So I try to see where people want to go, what they want to do. But I would say just write. And often if you're a young writer and you're in a classroom setting, you already have a structure built in that helps you because you have deadlines. But often older people who want to write, like I'll meet people who will say, I'm going to write as soon as I retire. And then when they retire, they're like, I just have too much time, I can't write. So I always say, like, just start where you are, you know, even if it means like wake up an hour earlier, or just like, and work the writing around the life that you have now. You know, as opposed to postponing it, or as opposed to like waiting for an idealized situation in which to write.
Now, we're going to have a question and answer portion of this, so I want you to think about questions that you will have of Edwidge. But Edwidge, I hear that you like surprises.
Oh.
I think you've read, I've read somewhere that you like surprises. Certainly in your stories, my goodness, there are surprises that come in the middle of a story that you think, oh, and you stop and you say, oh, she was pregnant? You know, that sort of thing. And you're constantly
there's no surprise
giving us
coming.
surprises. So we have a surprise for you from the library. And I'm going to ask Madame Chattel, Suzanne, to come out. This is proving that you can find something, anything in this vast cultural institution. Here, this is Suzanne Chattel, ladies and gentlemen.
Oh my God.
She is the director of the Hispanic Division and the Caribbean Division, and she is here to present something to Edwidge.
It's not my 12-year-old
First,
poem.
let me say that we know this won't fit in your luggage, and we'll make sure that we send it to you.
Okay.
Second, it is a privilege for me to be here, but I'm representing the work of many, many, many people who helped put this together. I'm going to show you, and I think maybe the audience will see, because you're going to recognize the person who is honored on this print very quickly. In fact, you said her name earlier when you were talking about being in the library and having that little box of books from Haiti. Have you seen this?
Oh my gosh. Is it Amour Colère?
This is
Oh my
Marie Vieux
gosh. Oh my gosh. It's Marie-Vieux Chauvet. Wow.
And it is her name, of course.
Oh my
Her
gosh.
likeness and words from a piece of her work in French. The wonderful thing about this piece is sort of like me representing a community, people working in print and photographs here, people working in manuscripts who we pulled from, and people working in the Hispanic division, and many, many other service divisions. To get a copy of this comes from, it's even better. This comes from a collection of 27, representing 27 letters in the Spanish alphabet.
Wow.
Marie is the T, you can see the T here. And each of those letters is an author from a different part of the Antilles who make up this lettered community of the Antilles.
Oh my goodness.
So the piece
Wow.
is called, and imagine a mural with 27 authors. The piece is called Las Antillas Letradas, the lettered Antilles. It's done by a Puerto Rican artist, Antonio Martorell, who sends his regards and says he's thrilled for us to make a copy of this for this particular purpose. And to give it to you because you are a part of this lettered community.
Oh my
in the
gosh.
Antilles.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Wow. It's, oh my gosh. Thank you. Well, I now want to, can you just leave it
Yes,
close
I
to
can
me?
leave it. I can leave it close. And I will invite you and everyone in the audience to come see this beautiful, beautiful piece. It comes with maps of all of the islands, as well as the images of the authors and their words in their language as well. So.
That's fantastic.
Fantastic.
But I want to tell them a little bit more about Marie-Vieux
Yeah,
Chauvet.
say some
because,
more.
So there is an English translation of her seminal work, which was L'Amour, Colère, Folie, Love, Anger, and Madness, and I wrote an introduction for it. It's in the Modern Library. But she died in exile in New York, but she was, one of our, certainly was one of our great writers, but is often the most cited story, and I mentioned in the introduction, and it's also in Create Dangerously, where this book, Amour, Colère, Folie, and it's wonderful that it's sort of in this space because the book was about to be published, and then someone came to her family and said, if this book is published, your entire family is going to be wiped out. And it was during the dictatorship. And she was already doing, she had a writers group called Les Araignées du Soir, Spiders of the Night, and they would meet secretly to write, and with some wonderful poets from Haiti. And so this book, which I think the words are from, was banned. The family bought all the copies so nobody would be killed. And the book wasn't even circulating for a very long time. And recently, we were able to work with the family and got the translation going. And it has been one of the things that I feel like, having had this career, one of the things I'm most proud is to have been a part of, that now people like my nieces and my nephews can read her books, even if they don't, read them in French. So this means like a whole lot. And it's wonderful. It's always great for me to walk into these spaces and bring people with me like that. And she came with me.
That's wonderful.
Thank you.
Now, we are going to have questions from the audience, and we have a microphone that will fly to your side if you raise your hand. So, questions of Edwidge?
We have a small,
Surely we
have a little one who has a question, a little girl back there.
Over here?
We'll start with the young one. Oh, okay, an elder.
Am I the little girl?
Oh, no, there's, yes, please. You
Hi,
can.
Edwidge. This is AJ.
Oh my God, AJ.
Nice to see
This
you.
is AJ Verdell, everybody. She wrote The Good Negress and other wonderful books. Hi, AJ. How are you?
I'm terrific. I'm happy to see you. I didn't actually have a question, but since this mic is in my face, I will ask you to talk a little bit more about speaking your beautiful language and being in a country where there's another language spoken, and what kind of pressure or not you feel that places on your writing.
Good question.
So my parents, when my brother and I got here, so we have my two younger brothers who are US born, and my parents be like, they'll teach you English, you guys make sure their Creole stays on point, And so I feel like the Creole I write the English I write has the Creole behind it. And I mean, when people talk about, like even when you say like the lyricism, I feel like that's all from like the way my parents were speaking, and there's so much metaphor, so many wonderful images and Creole and ways that sometimes our parents would be speaking around us, and they would be speaking Creole and we would speak Creole, but we had no idea what they were saying because they sort of had a roundabout way of speaking and all the double entendres, and the beauty of the language for me, I feel like, is certainly something that I carry with me in the English that I write, just as you do in your beautiful language. Certainly in the Good Negress, there's some stunning language, but it's also you give voice to the people, to the characters, the way they speak, and often, and it's something that in publishing sometimes if you present your book and they're like, oh, there's too much Spanish or too much Creole, and I'm not sure what these people, but to try to stay faithful to the way that you hear the characters is how the both like the Creole manifests for me in the English.
Thank you for the question. Another question over here?
Hi, my name is Gabby. I'm an English and creative writing student at Howard University. So I've been really lucky to get to read your works and study them in class with my peers and professors. I guess the question at the top of my head when I read your short stories, my favorite one is Children of the Sea. How do you decide when to keep something as a short story and when to expand it to a novel?
Thank you for coming, and thank you to your professor, who probably is giving you extra credit, I hope, for coming. And Children of the Sea is in Creek Crack. And Creek Crack is a collection of stories, and I've been, as I was thinking about this book, I think of the people in this book as kind of like the children and grandchildren of the characters in Creek Crack. So there's one story in Creek Crack, 1937, that started out as a short story and became The Farming of Bones. And that's really the only time that's happened for me, where I had a short story that then suddenly, that I felt like, oh, I need to say more, and became a novel. Usually, it works the other way. So there's a story in this book called 7 Stories that was like, I was writing a novel, like with these characters. And then I realized as I was writing along, I was like, I'm only writing this because I'm really enjoying the company of these people, but nothing is happening, It's just like, I really like being in this world, and I'm following them around in their fabulous life. And then I shrunk that into a short story. But often, and we were talking about that backstage, the thing that you're writing will often direct you in how it wants to be told. And you have to be, but sometimes there are times when you have to be brave enough to say, I need to trim this down. I need to kill my darlings, as they say, and get to the gist of it.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. Another question? Right here in the front?
Yes. And then you have to get to the little girl back there. Is that Gia? Gia, did you have your hand up? That's my niece.
Oh, okay.
Oh, is it Sasha? Oh, okay. Okay, I'm now afraid of your question, Sasha.
Let's start here.
Yes.
thank you for speaking so beautifully this evening about your, what I'll call your informal education, from the books in the libraries and the stories at the table and your own experiences. Could you speak just a little bit about your formal education and what parts of it were useful and which parts were not?
Well, I feel like it was all useful. I mean, even, at least that's what I want to convince my girls, right, about geometry. I'm like, it's all going to be useful in some way. But my formal education, you know, in Haiti was, initially was very rigorous. So my mom, I remember, took me to school when I was 3, and I went screaming and kicking, and it wasn't the kind of school where you're coloring at 3. It was like, really, you were already trying to read at 3, and so I started reading very early, under duress, but eventually I liked it, and it was, in formal education at that time was very, you know, you were reading, so I remember we were like before I was 12, you were like reading Voltaire, and it wasn't, and it was a very strict kind of school, which was made possible by the fact that my parents were able to send money from the States for us to go to that kind of school, and then there were state exams that you took, and so one was like the certificate, was like the big one, and so I took that when I was like 10, which was like I was on a speed track for this thing, and the way that you found out at that time, they don't do this anymore, if you passed, was like your name was read on the radio. So, so it was like read alphabetically, and then you would just like sit there and wait for them to say Danticat, and they're like, yeah. So, but if they went past your name, you were flunked, and then you had to either do the year over or take the exam. But when I came here, I went to a junior high school in Brooklyn, at Intermediate School 320, Jackie Robinson in Brooklyn, and then I went to Clara Barton High School for the health professions. And I initially didn't get into that school, but my father really wanted me to be a doctor. Like, on his deathbed, my dad was like, I'm not gonna have a doctor. You know? And so he went and convinced the principal to let me into that particular school so I could be a doctor. And so I didn't become a doctor, but by the time I graduated from that high school, I could have taken care of, like I would have been like a nurse's assistant or something. It was geared to that way. But at some point, when I went to Barnard, then I studied French literature, and I always told my parents, I said, well, I can be a teacher, and they're like, okay, whatever, it's not a doctor, but, you know. And then I started writing. But in formal education too, I think I studied. I decided to study French literature actually in order to better understand some of the literature that I read when I was younger. So I find that all of it was in some way helpful. Yeah.
That's a good question. Does your niece want to ask a question?
Do you have a question? No,
Right
she said
there?
no.
She said no? Okay. We have time for one last question. Here in the front, if there, oh, sorry.
Hello, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for coming.
It's exciting to hear you talk about how you write and the stories that you've told. And so I'm wondering, you mentioned Toni Morrison. I finished reading your book a few weeks ago, and I'm wondering, what do you have on your bedside table? What do you have stacked up next to your desk or bed for inspiration that you're interested in, that's kind of keeping you motivated and inspired?
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought up Toni Morrison. You know, both AJ and I, you know, knew Ms. Morrison, and after she passed, I started reading the books again. Now I'm at Tar Baby, which I hadn't it's funny because that's the Caribbean one, and I realized I hadn't read it, and so I'm reading her again. And there's some wonderful new books too. There's Dominicana by Angie Cruz, and Angie wrote a book called Let It Rain Coffee, and she's obviously from the Dominican Republic, and it's a really incredible book about a young woman who comes to the U.S. young. It's almost like a child bride, and it's really a strong book. And so those two, but I'm going back like through Ms. Morrison, and part of it as, you know, as a way of having her in my mind, but also learning, because one of the things, like for the young writers out there, one of the things I used to do for myself when I just started, it's more like the informal education element of it, is I would sometimes read like a writer's entire oeuvre through like in a summer. So I would start with the first book and read through their last book as almost like a course for myself, because you can see how they're growing. And because, you know, when you're in the craft too, you know how you're growing. You know there are things that you hadn't done before that you're like, oh, things that I'm learning. So I like to see how a writer's progressing, and then you start noticing some threads. And so that's one way I have instructed myself, and I feel like I'm relearning her work also, but also relearning a whole new things about, like, if you're going through the work linearly, and it's like you're traveling with the writer. So I feel like I'm traveling with her through these works.
Well, Edwidge, we are so fortunate to have had you here. You are a wonderful representative from Haiti. I know the weight of Haiti should not fall on your shoulders, but you carry it very well. And we so appreciate your work for so many years. 21 books and numerous essays and short stories, and so much work in the world for literature. So we thank you, Edwidge. Thank you so much for joining us. The Library of Congress, thank you.
Thank you. And thank you.